in matters of morality, speaking of aristocratic ages. I doubt that men, he says, were more virtuous in aristocratic centuries than in others, but it is certain that the beauties of virtue were constantly spoken of. Only in secret, he concludes, did men study its utility. You might think about that passage, perhaps, in section. But note that Tocqueville adds to the concept of self-interest this idea, or this modifier, of well understood. Well understood. What does this add? What is he intending that to say? Self-interest well understood is not the same thing as egoism, or what Rousseau called amour propre, for example. It is not the desire simply to be talked about, to be looked at, to be first in the race of life in that way. Rather, self-interest is connected, and self-interest well understood is connected to this passion for well-being and the desire to improve one's conditions that remain for Tocqueville a very important wellspring of human actions. But it is important to remember that these are not the only desires, or these are not the only motives for action. Tocqueville probably is distinguished from many social scientists today by suggesting that self-interest well understood is not some kind of universal determinant of human behavior. It is not something universal. It is a product of a particular social state, a particular, we might say, the democratic social state. He is not, in this sense, a kind of moral or psychological reductionist who wants to see one cause of human behavior across all centuries and all climates. He is not saying that all behavior is self-interested. In fact, in that very chapter on self-interest rightly understood, you will remember, you may remember, probably don't remember, that he quotes in a footnote an essay by Montaigne, a name that I've mentioned before, an essay by Montaigne called Of Glory, to remind the reader that the desire for fame and honor will always contend with the desire for well-being and happiness. And in many ways, these are two conflicting motives of human behavior. What did he believe that this ethic of self-interest well understood would bring about? Again, like compassion, the doctrine of self-interest has done much to sort of soften the harsher features of the aristocratic ethics of the warlike nobility. Self-interest well understood is a kind of antidote to an ethic of fame and glory. And yet you can see throughout Volume 2 especially how Tocqueville laments the decline of this older aristocratic codes of honor and chivalry. By contrast, the doctrine of self-interest well understood is not lofty, he says, but it is clear and sure. It has characteristics of reliability and predictability. It is not itself a virtue, he says, but it can form people who are, and these are his terms, regulated, temperate, moderate, foresighted, masters of themselves. Regulated, temperate, moderate, farsighted. What does that sound like? Think about that. What kind of person is this, and what has it created? These are the virtues of the democratic republic. Again, these may not be heroic or extraordinary qualities, but they do have the virtue of being within the range of everyone. But is such a code, or is such a moral code desirable for itself? That's something that Tocqueville leaves a little bit up in the air. Of all philosophical theories, he calls them, as he calls it, the doctrine of self-interest rightly understood is, he says, the most appropriate to the needs of men in our time. Think about that judgment. It is the most appropriate to the needs of men in our time. It doesn't seem to suggest that this is either universal or necessarily that it is the best. It is simply the best adapted to the needs of our time. to our level of humanity, to where we are now. And again, there is a implicit, to be sure, an implicit kind of critique suggested in that phrase that you might think about as you read or as you go back to that important chapter on self-interest and its role in, again, the shaping of the modern democratic individual. So these three characteristics, compassion, what was the other one? What? Restlessness, yes, oh good. Yes, I can't even remember what I'm talking about. Restlessness and self-interest. I was quizzing him. I was just checking. It doesn't have anything to do with short-term memory loss. These are what has shaped us. And Tocqueville holds this up as a kind of portrait of a democratic individual. And also, of course, primarily to, not so much to the democratic individual, but to his readers back in France, and saying this seems to be the future shape of humanity, of democratic humanity. We need both to adapt to it in some ways. We have to both recognize that this is what's coming and adapt to it. But we also have to be, to some degree, wary of what is coming and what kind of people we may create out of ourselves, what may be created. And this brings me to the theme that I mentioned at the beginning about democratic statecraft, democratic education. What is the role of the statesman in a democratic age? How should one adapt as well as try to guide these features? Democracy in America is a work of political education, a supreme work of political education, addressed to leaders or potential leaders, not only for Tocqueville's time, but for the future. The possibilities of statecraft are, as they are always, dependent on what we understand politics and political science to be. What is it? In the introduction to the book, in one of those characteristically epigrammatic sentences, and you should be attuned to these, Tocqueville often likes to give these one-sentence paragraphs to highlight an idea, to really make it stand out. I don't recommend it for you, but for him, he takes one sentence and can make it, turns it into a paragraph. He talks about this book, he says, is a new political science for a world altogether new. That statement has to jump out at you at the page. What is this new political science? A new political science, again, in some ways following Machiavelli, who had that departs from the ancients, but perhaps also from his modern predecessors too, like Machiavelli and Hobbes or Locke and Rousseau. What is the distinguishing feature of the political science for a new democratic age, for a world altogether new? Tocqueville's new political science, let me suggest to you, is based on a novel and profound understanding of the relationship between history or historical forces and human agency, between individual power and individual powers or agency and historical forces. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. As any reader of The Democracy quickly notes, even from the opening pages of the book, Tocqueville attributes a kind of providential power to history. The immense, centuries-long progress or transition from the aristocratic to the democratic era seems to be, as he describes it, almost an act of divine providence, almost of divine will. He warns his readers that it is a mistake, it is self-defeating to try to resist or to turn back this movement. This would be futile. It would not only be futile, he even suggests it would be impious. It would be, in some ways, to go against the will of God, as if the hand of God were behind this immense historical progress or process. Tocqueville, no doubt, deliberately overstates that argument, but he does so, I think, in order to make a serious and profound point. Our politics are deeply embedded within long structures of human history that we can do little to alter and escape. We seem to be deeply embedded, we as individuals, deeply embedded within these structures. This is to use a term that modern political scientists often use to describe this, it is an argument from what is often called path dependency, that we are, again, deeply embedded within historical processes, tendencies, paths of development that we can do little to resist or control. And in many ways, you will find Tocqueville often writing as if he is some kind of historical or sociological determinist, allowing little room for individual initiative or agency. Words like fate, destiny, tendency are frequently used throughout the book to underscore the limits of political action. It would even be an interesting experiment to go through the book page by page and find how many examples of those kinds of words, tendency, fate, destiny, these kind of deterministic words that suggest irresistible movement of history. How many times he uses this and in what context. And he frequently offers predictions throughout the book on the basis of what he regards to be underlying historical and social trends. You can hardly read a page of the book, sometimes not even a paragraph, without finding in it some kind of prediction based on these trends. Again, I would ask you, if you have time, go through the book. You don't have time this semester. Maybe it will be a great senior essay later on, to go through the book and find examples, as many as you can, of, again, predictions that Tocqueville makes on the basis of these historical, this claim about historical forces. And much of this seems to deny, taken literally, much of this would seem to deny the role of independent human initiative or statecraft in history. Consider the following passage from pages 154 and 55 of your translation. Here's what Tocqueville writes about the statesman. He says, sometimes after 1,000 efforts, the legislator succeeds in exerting an indirect influence on the destiny of nations, and then one celebrates his genius, whereas often the geographical position of the country, about which he can do nothing, a social state that was created without his concurrence, mores and ideas of whose origin he is ignorant, a point of departure unknown to him, impart irresistible movements to society against which he struggles in vain and which carry him along in turn. There you go. He gives us a list of all of the different determinants of human, surrounding conditions, geography, mores, social position. These, he says, impart an irresistible movements to society.